Novice by James H. Schmitz. Section 1. A novice is one who is inexperienced, but that doesn't mean incompetent, nor does it mean stupid. There was, Telsey Amberdawn thought, someone besides T.T. and herself in the garden. Not, of course, Aunt Hillette, who was in the house waiting for an early visitor to arrive, and not one of the servants. Someone, or something else, must be concealed among the thickets of magnificently flowering native Jonturu shrubs about Telsey. She could think of no other way to account for Tik-Tok's spooked behavior, nor, to be honest about it, for the manner her own nerves were acting up without visible cause this morning. Telsey plucked a blade of grass, slipped the end between her lips and chewed it gently, her face puzzled and concerned. She wasn't ordinarily afflicted with nervousness. 15 years old, genius level, brown as a berry, and not at all bad looking in her sunbriefs, she was the youngest member of one of Orado's most prominent families and a second-year law student at one of the most exclusive schools in the Federation of the Hub. Her physical, mental, and emotional health, she'd always been informed, was excellent. Aunt Hillette's frequent cracks about the inherent instability of the genius level could be ignored. Hillette's own stability seemed questionable at best. But none of that made the present odd situation any less disagreeable. The trouble might have begun, Telsey decided, during the night, within an hour after they arrived in the spaceport at the guest house Hillette had rented in Port Neche for their vacation on Jutaru. Telsey had retired at once to her second-story bedroom with Tik-Tok, but she barely got to sleep before something awakened her again. Turning over, she discovered T.T. reared up before the window, her forepaws on the sill, big cat head outlined against the star-hazed night sky, staring fixedly down into the garden. Telsey, only curious at that point, climbed out of bed and joined T.T. at the window. There was nothing in particular to be seen, and if the scents and minor night sounds which came from the garden weren't exactly what they were used to, Jonturu was, after all, an unfamiliar planet. What else would one expect here? But Tik-Tok's muscular back felt tense and rigid when Telsey laid her arm across it, and except for an absent-minded dig with her forehead against Telsey's shoulder, T.T. refused to let her attention be distracted from whatever had absorbed it. Now and then a low, ominous rumble came from her furry throat, a half-angry, half-questioning sound. Telsey began to feel a little uncomfortable. She finally managed to coax Tik-Tok away from the window, but neither of them slept well the rest of the night. At breakfast, Aunt Hillette made one of her typical nasty sweet remarks. "You look so fatigued, dear, as if you were under some severe mental strain, which, of course, you might be," Hillette added musingly. With her gold blonde hair piled high on her head and her peaches and cream complexion, Hillette looked fresh as a daisy herself, a malicious daisy. "Now, wasn't I right in insisting to Jessamine that you needed a vacation away from that terribly intellectual school?" She smiled gently. "Absolutely," Telsey agreed, restraining the impulse to fling a spoonful of egg yolk at her father's younger sister. Aunt Hillette often inspired such impulses, but Telsey had promised her mother to avoid actual battles on the Jonturu trip if possible. After breakfast, she went out to the back garden with Tik-Tok, who immediately walked into a thicket, camouflaged herself, and vanished from sight. It seemed to add up to something, but what? Telsey strolled about the garden a while, maintaining a pretense of nonchalant interest in Jonturu's flowers and colorful bug life. She experienced the most curious little chills of alarm from time to time, but discovered no signs of a lurking intruder, or of T.T. either. Then, for half an hour or more, she just sat cross-legged in the grass, waiting quietly for Tik-Tok to show up of her own accord, and the big lunkhead hadn't obliged. Telsey scratched a tanned kneecap, scowled at Portnichet's parked trees beyond the garden wall. It seemed idiotic to feel scared when she couldn't even tell whether there was anything to be scared about. And, aside from that, another unreasonable feeling kept growing stronger by the minute now. This was to the effect that she should be doing some unstated but specific thing. In fact, TikTok wanted her to do some specific thing. Completely idiotic. Abruptly, Telsey closed her eyes, thought sharply, TikTok? And waited, suddenly very angry at herself for having given in to her fancies to this extent, for whatever might happen. She had never really established that she was able to tell by some kind of symbolic mind picture method, like a short waking dream, approximately what TT was thinking and feeling 5 years before when she discovered TikTok, an odd-looking and otter-behaved stray kitten then, in the woods near the Amberdons' summer home on Orlando. Telsey had thought so, but it might never have been more than a colorful play of her imagination, and after she got into law school and grew increasingly absorbed in her studies, she almost forgot the matter again. Today, perhaps, because she was disturbed about TikTok's behavior, the customary response was extraordinarily prompt. The warm glow of sunlight shining through her closed eyelids faded out quickly and was replaced by some inner darkness. In the darkness there appeared then an image of TikTok sitting a little way off beside an open door in an old stone wall, green eyes fixed on Telsey. Telsey got the impression that TT was inviting her to go through the door, and for some reason the thought frightened her. Again, there was an immediate reaction. The scene with TikTok in the door vanished, and Telsey felt she was standing in a pitch-black room, knowing that if she moved even one step forwards, something that was waiting there silently would reach out and grab her. Naturally, she recoiled, and at once found herself sitting, eyes still closed and the sunlight bathing her lids in the grass of the guest-house garden. She opened her eyes, looked around. Her heart was thumping rapidly. The experience couldn't have lasted more than 4 or 5 seconds, but it had been extremely vivid. A whole compact little nightmare. None of her earlier experiments at getting into mental communication with TT had been like that. It served her right, Telsey thought, for trying such a childish stunt at the moment. What she should have done at once was to make a methodical search for the foolish beast. TT was bound to be somewhere nearby. Locate her behind her camouflage and hang on to her then until this nonsense in the garden was explained. Talented as TikTok was at blotting herself out, it usually was possible to spot her if one directed one's attention to shadow patterns. Telsey began a surreptitious study of the flowering bushes about her. 3 minutes later, off to her right, where the ground was banked beneath the 6-foot step in the garden terraces, TikTok's outline suddenly caught her eye. Flat on her belly, head lifted above her paws, quite motionless, TT seemed like a transparent wraith stretched out along the terrace, barely discernible even when stared at directly. It was convincing illusion, but what seemed to be rocks, plant leaves, and sun-splotched earth seen through the wraith outline was simply the camouflage pattern TT had printed for the moment on her hide. She could have changed it completely in an instant to conform to a different background. Telsey pointed an accusing finger. "See you," she announced, feeling a surge of relief, which seemed as unaccountable as the rest of it. The wraith twitched one ear in acknowledgement, the head outline shifting as the camouflaged face turned toward Telsey. Then the inwardly uncamouflaged, very substantial-looking mouth opened slowly, showing TikTok's red tongue and curved white tusks. The mouth stretched in a wide yawn, snapped shut with a click of meshing teeth, became indistinguishable again. Next, a pair of camouflaged lids drew back from TT's round, brilliant green eyes. The eyes stared across the lawn at Telsey. Telsey said irritably, "Quit clowning around, TT." The eyes blinked, and TikTok's natural bronze-brown color suddenly flowed over her head, down her neck and across her body into legs and tail. Against the side of the terrace, as if materializing in solidity at the moment, appeared 200 pounds of supple, rangy, long-tailed cat, or cat-like creature. TT's actual origin had never been established. The best guesses were that what Telsey had found playing around in the woods 5 years ago was either a biostructural experiment which had gotten away from a private laboratory on Oredo, or some spaceman's lost pet brought to the capital planet from one of the remote colonies beyond the hub. On top of TT's head was a large, fluffy pom-pom of white fur, which might have looked ridiculous on another animal, but didn't on her. Even as a fat kitten, hanging head down from the side of a wall by the broad sucker pads on her paws, TT had possessed enormous dignity. Telsey studied her, the feeling of relief fading again. Tick-Tock, ordinarily the most restful and composed of companions, definitely was still tensed up about something. That big lazy yawn a moment ago, the attitude of stretched out relaxation, all pure sham. "What is eating you?" she asked in exasperation. The green eyes stared at her, solemn, watchful, seeming for that fleeting instant quite alien. And why, Telsey thought, should the old question of what Tick-Tock really was pass through her mind just now? After a rather alarming rate of growth began to taper off last year, nobody had cared anymore. For a moment, Telsey had the uncanny certainty of having had the answer to this situation almost in her grasp. An answer which appeared to involve the world of Shanturu, Tick-Tock, and of all unlikely factors, Aunt Halat? She shook her head. TT's impassive green eyes blinked. Shantaru. The planet lay outside Telsey's sphere of personal interest, but she'd read up on it on the way here from Oredo. Among all the worlds of the hub, Shanturu was the paradise for zoologists and sportsmen, a gigantic animal preserve, its continents and seas swarming with magnificent game. Under Federation law, it was being retained deliberately in the primitive state in which it had been discovered. Port Neche, the only city, actually the only inhabited point on Shanturu, was beautiful and quiet, a pattern of vast but elegantly slender towers, each separated from the others by 4 or 5 miles of rolling parkland and interconnected only by the threads of transparent skyways. Near the horizon, just visible from the garden, rose the tallest tower of all, the green and gold spires of the Shikaris Club, a center of Federation affairs and social activity. From the air car which brought them across Port Neche the evening before, Telsey had seen occasional strings of guest houses, similar to the one Halet had rented, nestling along the park slopes. Nothing very sinister about Port Neche or Green Jartaro, surely. Halet? That blonde, slinky, would-be Machiavelli? What could? Telsey's eyes narrowed reflectively. There'd been a minor occurrence. At least it had seemed minor. Just before the spaceliner docked last night, a young woman from one of the newscasting services had asked for an interview with the daughter of Federation Councilwoman Jessamine Amberdon. This happened occasionally, and Telsey had no objections until the news shen gossipy persistence in inquiring about the unusual pet she was bringing to Port Neche with her began to be annoying. TT might be somewhat unusual, but that was not a matter of general interest, and Telsey said so. Then Halet moved smoothly into the act and held forth on Tick-Tock's appearance, habits, and mysterious antecedents in considerable detail. Telsey had assumed that Halet was simply going out of her way to be irritating, as usual. Looking back on the incident, however, it occurred to her that the chatter between her aunt and the newscast woman had sounded oddly stilted, almost like something the two might have rehearsed. Rehearsed for what purpose? Tick-Tock, Shanturu. Telsey chewed gently on her lower lip. A vacation on Shanturu for the two of them and TT had been Halet's idea, and Hillette had enthused about it so much that Telsey's mother at last talked her into accepting. Hillette, Jessamine explained privately to Telsey, had felt they were intruders in the Amberdawn family, had bitterly resented Jessamine's political honors and, more recently, Telsey's own emerging promise of brilliance. This invitation was Hillette's way of indicating a change of heart. Wouldn't Telsey oblige? So Telsey had obliged. Though she took very little stock in Hillette's change of heart, she wasn't, in fact, putting it past her aunt to have some involved dirty trick up her sleeve with this trip to Shantaro. Hillette's mind worked like that. So far, there had been no actual indications of purposeful mischief, but logic did seem to require a connection between the various puzzling events here. A newscaster's rather forced-looking interest in TikTok. Hillette could easily have paid for that interview. Then TT's disturbed behavior during their first night in Port-Neches, and Telsey's own formless anxieties and fancies in connection with the guest house garden. The last remained hard to explain. But TikTok and Hillette might know something about Shantaro that she didn't know. Her mind returned to the results of the half-serious attempt she'd made to find out whether there was something TikTok wanted her to do. An open door, a darkness where somebody waited to grab her if she took even one step forwards. It couldn't have had any significance, or could it? So you'd like to try magic, Telsey scoffed at herself. Baby games. How far would you have got at law school if you'd asked TT to help with your problems? Then why had she been thinking about it again? She shivered because an eerie stillness seemed to settle on the garden. From the side of the terrace, TT's green eyes watched her. Telsey had a feeling of sinking down slowly into a sunlit dream, into something very remote from law school problems. "Should I go through the door?" she whispered. The bronze cat shape raised its head slowly. TT began to purr. TikTok's name had been derived in kittenhood from the manner in which she purred, a measured, oscillating sound shifting from high to low, as comfortable and often as continuous as the unobtrusive pulse of an old clock. It was the first time, Telsey realized now, that she'd heard the sound since their arrival on Shantaro. It went on for a dozen seconds or so, then stopped. TikTok continued to look at her. It appeared to have been an expression of definite assent. The dreamlike sensation increased, hazing over Telsey's thoughts. If there was nothing to this mind communication thing, what harm could symbols do? This time she wouldn't let them alarm her. And if they did mean something? She closed her eyes. The sun glow outside faded instantly. Telsey caught a fleeting picture of a door in the wall and knew in the same moment that she'd already passed through it. She was not in the dark room then, but poised at the edge of a brightness which seemed featureless and without limit, spread out around her with a feeling tone like sea or sky, but it was an unquiet place. There was a sense of unseen things on all sides watching her and waiting. Was this another form of the dark room? A trap set up in her mind? Telsey's attention did a quick shift. She was seated in the grass again. The sunlight beyond her closed eyelids seemed to shine in quietly through rose-tinted curtains. Cautiously, she let her awareness return to the bright area, and it was still there. She had a moment of excited elation. She was controlling this. And why not, she asked herself. These things were happening in her mind, after all. She would find out what they seemed to mean, but she would be in no rush to. An impression, as if behind her, TikTok had thought, "Now I can help again." Then a feeling of being swept swiftly, irresistibly forwards, thrust out and down. The brightness exploded in thundering colors around her. In fright, she made the effort to snap her eyes open, to be back in the garden. But now she couldn't make it work. The colors continued to roar about her like a confusion of excited, laughing, triumphant voices. Telsey felt caught in the middle of it all, suspended in invisible spider webs. Tick-Tock seemed to be somewhere nearby, looking on. Faithless, treacherous TT. Telsey's mind made another wrenching effort, and there was a change. She hadn't got back into the garden, but the noisy, swirling colors were gone, and she had the feeling of reading a rapidly moving microtape now, though she didn't actually see the tape. The tape, she realized, was another symbol for what was happening, a symbol easier for her to understand. There were voices, or what might be voices, around her. On the invisible tape, she seemed to be reading what they said. A number of speakers, apparently involved in a fast, hot argument about what to do with her. Impressions flashed past. Why waste time with her? It was clear that Kitten Talk was all she was capable of. Not necessarily. That was a normal first step. Give her a little time. But what, exasperatedly, could such a small bite possibly know that would be of significant value? There was a slow, blurred, awkward-seeming interruption. Its content was not comprehensible to Telsey at all, but in some unmistakable manner it was defined as Tick-Tock's thought. A pause as the circle of speakers stopped to consider whatever TT had thrown into the debate. Then another impression, one that sent a shock of fear through Telsey as it rose heavily into her awareness. Its sheer intensity momentarily displaced the tape-reading symbolism. A savage voice seemed to rumble. "Toss the tender small bite to me." Malevolent crimson eyes fixed on Telsey from somewhere not far away. "And let's be done here." Startled, stammering protest from Tick-Tock, accompanied by gusts of laughter from the circle. Great sense of humor these characters had, Telsey thought bitterly. That crimson-eyed thing wasn't joking at all. More laughter as the circle caught her thought. Then a kind of majority opinion found sudden expression. "Smallbite is learning. No harm to wait. We'll find out quickly. Let's—" The tape ended. The voices faded. The colors went blank. In whatever jumbled up form she'd been getting the impressions at that point, Telsey couldn't have begun to describe it. The whole thing suddenly stopped. She found herself sitting in the grass, shaky, scared, eyes open. Tick-Tock stood beside the terrace looking at her. An air of hazy unreality still hung about the garden. She might have flipped. She didn't think so, but it certainly seemed possible. Otherwise, Telsey made an attempt to sort over what had happened. Something had been in the garden. Something had been inside her mind. Something that was at home on Shintaro. There'd been a feeling of perhaps 50 or 60 of these, beings? Alarming beings. Reckless, wild, hard, and that red-eyed nightmare? Telsey shuddered. They'd contacted Tick-Tock first during the night. TT understood them better than she could. Why? Telsey found no immediate answer. Then Tick-Tock had tricked her into letting her mind be invaded by these things. There must have been a very definite reason for that. She looked over at Tick-Tock. TT looked back. Nothing stirred in Telsey's thoughts. Between them, there was still no direct communication. Then how had the beings been able to get through to her? Telsey wrinkled her nose. Assuming this was real, it seemed clear that the game of symbols she'd made up between herself and TT had provided the opening. Her whole experience just now had been in the form of symbols, translating whatever occurred into something she could consciously grasp. Kitten talk was how the beings referred to the use of symbols. They seemed contemptuous of it. Never mind, Telsey told herself. They'd agreed she was learning. The air over the grass appeared to flicker. Again she had the impression of reading words off a quickly moving, not quite visible tape. "You're being taught and you're learning," was what she seemed to read. The question was whether you were capable of partial understanding, as your friend insisted. Since you were, everything else that can be done will be accomplished very quickly. A pause, and then a touch of approval. You're a well-formed mind, Small Bite. Odd, and with incomprehensibilities, but well-formed. One of the beings, and a fairly friendly one, at least not unfriendly, Telsey framed a tentative mental question. Who are you? You'll know very soon. The flickering ended, and she realized she and the question had been dismissed for the moment. She looked over at TikTok again. Can't you talk to me now, TT? She asked silently, a feeling of hesitation. Kitten talk, was the impression that formed itself with difficulty then. It was awkward, searching, but it came unquestionably from TT. Still learning too, Telsey. TT seemed half anxious, half angry. A sharp buzz note reached Telsey's ears, wiping out the groping thought impression. She jumped a little, glanced down. Her wrist talker was signaling. For a moment, she seemed poised uncertainly between a world where unseen, dangerous-sounding beings referred to one as Small Bite, and where TT was learning to talk, and the familiar other world where wrist communicators buzzed periodically in a matter-of-fact manner. Settling back into the more familiar world, she switched on the talker. Yes, she said, her voice sounding husky. Telsey, dear, Halette murmured honey-sweet from the talker. Would you come back into the house, please? The living room. We have a visitor who very much wants to meet you. Telsey hesitated, eyes narrowing. Halette's visitor wanted to meet her? Why? She asked. He has something very interesting to tell you, dear. The edge of triumphant malice showed for an instant, vanishing in murmuring sweetness again. So please hurry. All right. Telsey stood up. I'm coming. Fine, dear. The talker went dead. Telsey switched off the instrument, noticed that TikTok had chosen to disappear meanwhile. Flipped? She wondered. Starting up towards the house, it was clear Aunt Halette had prepared some unpleasant surprise to spring on her, which was hardly more than normal behavior for Halette. The other business? She couldn't be certain of anything there. Leaving out TT's strange actions, which might have a number of causes after all, that entire string of events could have been created inside her head. There was no contradictory evidence so far. But it could do no harm to take what seemed to have happened at face value. Some pretty grim event might be shaping up, in a very real way around here. You reason logically. The impression now was of a voice speaking to her, a voice that made no audible sound. It was the same being who'd addressed her a minute or two ago. The two worlds between which Telsey felt suspended seemed to glide slowly together and become one. I go to law school, she explained to the being almost absently. Amused agreement. So we heard. What do you want of me? Telsey inquired. You'll know soon enough. Why not tell me now? Telsey urged. It seemed about to dismiss her again. Quick impatience flared at her. Kitten pictures. Kitten thoughts. Kitten talk. Too slow. Too slow. Your pictures. Too much you. Wait till the... Circuits closed. Channels open. Obstructions clear? What had it said? There'd only been a blurred image of a finicky, delicate, but perfectly normal technical operation of some kind. Minutes now, the voice concluded. A pause, then another thought tossed carelessly at her. This is more important to you, Small Bite, than to us. The voice impression ended as sharply as if a communicator had snapped off. Not too friendly. Telsey walked on toward the house, a new fear growing inside her. A fear like the awareness of a storm gathered nearby, still quiet, deadly quiet, but ready to break. Kitten pictures. A voice seemed to jeer distantly, a whispering in the park trees beyond the garden wall. Halette's cheeks were lightly pinked. Her blue eyes sparkled. She looked downright stunning, which meant to anyone who knew her that the worst side of Hillette's nature was chomping at the bit. On uninformed males, it had a dazzling effect, however, and Telsey wasn't surprised to find their visitor wearing a tranced expression when she came into the living room. He was a tall, outdoorsy man with a tanned, bony face, a neatly trained black mustache, and a scar down one cheek, which would have seemed dashing if it hadn't been for the stupefied look. Beside his chair stood a large, clumsy instrument, which might have been some kind of telecamera. Hillette performed introductions. Their visitor, Dr. Droon, a zoologist. He had been tuned in on Telsey's newscast interview on the liner the night before and wondered whether Telsey would care to discuss TikTok with him. "Frankly, no," Telsey said. Dr. Droon came awake and gave Telsey a surprised look. Hillette smiled easily. "My niece doesn't intend to be discourteous, Doctor," she explained. "Of course not," the zoologist agreed doubtfully. "It's just," Hillette went on, "that Telsey's a little, sensitive where TikTok is concerned. In her own way, she's attached to the animal. Aren't you, dear?" "Yes," Telsey said blandly. "Well, we hope this isn't going to disturb you too much, dear." Hillette glanced significantly at Dr. Droon. "Dr. Droon, you must understand, is simply, well, there is something very important he must tell you now." Telsey transferred her gaze back to the zoologist. Dr. Droon cleared his throat. I understand, Miss Amberden, that you're unaware what kind of creature your TikTok is?" Telsey started to speak, then checked herself, frowning. She had been about to state that she knew exactly what kind of creature TT was, but she didn't, of course. Or did she? She scowled absent-mindedly at Dr. Droon, biting her lip. "Telsey?" Hillette prompted gently. "Huh?" Telsey said. "Oh, please, go on, Doctor." Dr. Droon steepled his fingers. "Well," he said, your pet, is a young crest cat, nearly full-grown now, apparently, and—" "Why, yes," Telsey cried. The zoologist looked at her. "You knew that?" "Well, not really," Telsey admitted. "Or sort of." She laughed, her cheeks flushed. "This is the most—" "Go ahead, please. Sorry I interrupted." She stared at the wall beyond Dr. Droon with a rapt expression. The zoologist and Hillette exchanged glances, then Dr. Droon resumed cautiously. "The crest cats," he said, "were a species native to Toronto. Their existence had been known for only 8 years. The species appeared to have had a somewhat limited range. The Balut Mountains on the opposite side of the huge continent on which Port Neches had been built." Telsey barely heard him. A very curious thing was happening. For every sentence Dr. Droon uttered, a dozen other sentences appeared in her awareness. More accurately, it was as if an instantaneous, smooth flow of information relevant to whatever he said arose continuously from what might have been almost her own memory, but wasn't. Within a minute or two, she knew more about crest cats of Jontoru than Dr. Droon could have told her in hours, much more than he'd ever known. She realized suddenly that he'd stopped talking, that he'd asked her a question. "Miss Amberden?" he repeated now, with a note of uncertainty. "Yari," Telsey told him softly. "I'll drink your blood." "Eh?" Telsey blinked, focused on Dr. Droon, wrenching her mind away from a splendid view of the misty blue peaks of the Balut Range. "Sorry," she said briskly. "Just a joke." She smiled. "Now, what were you saying?" The zoologist looked at her in a rather odd manner for a moment. "I was inquiring," he said then, "whether you were familiar with the sporting rules established by the various hunting associations of the hub in connection with taking of game trophies." Telsey shook her head. "No, I've never heard of them." The rules, Dr. Droon explained, laid down the type of equipment, weapons, spotting, tracking instruments, number of assistants, and so forth, a sportsman could legitimately use in the pursuit of any specific type of game. Before the end of the first year after their discovery, he went on, the Balut crest cats had been placed in the ultra equipment class. "What is ultra equipment?" Telsey asked. Well, Dr. June said thoughtfully, it doesn't quite involve the use of full battle armor. Not quite. And of course, even with that classification, the sporting principle of mutual accessibility must be observed. Mutual. Oh, I see. Telsey paused. Another wave of silent information rose into her awareness. Went on. So the game has to be able to get at the sportsman too, eh? That's correct. Except in the pursuit of various classes of flying animals, a shikari would not, for example, be permitted the use of an air car other than the means of a simple transportation. Under these conditions, it was soon established that the crest cats were being obtained by sportsmen who went after them at rather consistent 1-to-1 ratio. Telsey's eyes widened. She'd gathered something similar from her other information source, but hadn't quite believed it. 100 killed for each cat bagged? She said, that's pretty rough sport, isn't it? Extremely rough sport, Dr. June agreed dryly. In fact, when the statistics were published, the sporting interest in winning a balut cat trophy appears to have suffered a sudden and sharp decline. On the other hand, a more scientific interest in these remarkable animals was coincidentally created, and many permits for their acquisition by the agents of museums, universities, public and private collections were issued. Sporting rules, of course, do not apply to that activity. Telsey nodded absently. I see. They used air cars, didn't they? A sort of heavy knockout gun? Air cars, long-range detectors, stun guns are standard equipment in such work, Dr. June acknowledged. Gas and poison are employed, of course, as circumstances dictate. The collectors were relatively successful for a while. Then a curious thing happened. Less than 2 years after their existence became known, the crest cats of the balut range were extinct. The inroads made on their numbers by man cannot begin to account for this, so it must be assumed that a sudden plague wiped them out. At any rate, not another living member of the species has been seen on Shanturu until you landed here with your pet last night. Telsey sat silent for some seconds, not because of what he said, but because the other knowledge was still flowing into her mind. On one very important point, that was at variance with what the zoologist had stated, and from there a coldly logical pattern was building up. Telsey didn't grasp the pattern in complete detail yet, but what she saw of it stirred her with half-incredulous dread. She asked, shaping the words carefully, but with only a small part of her attention on what she was really saying. Just what does all this have to do with TikTok, Dr. June? Dr. June glanced at Halette and returned his gaze to Telsey. Looking very uncomfortable but quite determined, he told her, Miss Amberden, there is a Federation law which states that when a species is threatened with extinction, any available survivors must be transferred to the life banks of the University League to ensure their indefinite preservation. Under the circumstances, this law applies to, TikTok. End of section 1. Section 2. So that had been Halette's trick. She found out about the crest cats, might have put in as much as a few months arranging to make the discovery of TT's origin on Shanturu seem a regrettable mischance, something no one could have foreseen or prevented. In the life banks, from what Telsey had heard of them, TT would cease to exist as an individual awareness, while scientists tinkered around with the possibility of reconstructing her species. Telsey studied her aunt's carefully sympathizing face for an instant, asked Dr. June, What about the other crest cats? You said were collected before they became extinct here? Wouldn't they be enough for what the life bank needs? He shook his head. 2 immature male specimens are known to exist, and they are at present in the life banks. The others that were taken alive at the time have been destroyed, often under nearly disastrous circumstances. They are enormously cunning, enormously savage creatures, Miss Amberden. The additional fact that they can conceal themselves to the point of being virtually indetectable except by the use of instruments makes them one of the most dangerous animals known. Since the young female which you raised as a pet has remained docile, so far, you may not really be able to appreciate that. Perhaps I can, Telsey said. She nodded at the heavy-looking instrument standing beside the chair. And that's... It's a life detector combined with a stun gun, Miss Amberden. I have no intention of harming your pet, but we can't take chances of any animal of that type. The gun's charge will knock it unconscious for several minutes, just long enough for me to secure it with paralysis belts. You're a collector for the life banks, Dr. Droon. That's correct. Dr. Droon, Hillette remarked, has obtained a permit from the planetary moderator authorizing him to claim TikTok for the University League and remove her from the planet, dear. So you see, there is simply nothing we can do about the matter. Your mother wouldn't like us to attempt to obstruct the law, would she? Hillette paused. The permit should have your signature, Telsey, but I can sign in your stead if necessary. That was Hillette's way of saying it would do no good to appeal to Jean Turu's planetary moderator. She'd taken the precaution of getting his assent to the matter first. So now, if you'll just call TikTok, dear, Hillette went on. Telsey barely heard the last words. She felt herself stiffening slowly while the living room almost faded from her sight. Perhaps in that instant some additional new circuit had closed in her mind, or some additional new channel had been opened, for TT's purpose in tricking her into the contact with the reckless, mocking beings outside was suddenly and numbingly clear. And what it meant immediately was that she'd have to get out of the house without being spotted at it and go someplace where she could be undisturbed for half an hour. She realized that Hillette and the zoologist were both staring at her. Are you ill, dear? No. Telsey stood up. It would be worse than useless to try to tell these two anything. Her face must be pretty white at the moment. She could feel it. But they assumed, of course, that the shock of losing TT had just now sunk in on her. I'll have to check on that law you mentioned before I sign anything, she told Dr. Droon. Why, yes, he started to get out of his chair. I'm sure that can be arranged, Miss Amberden. Don't bother to call the moderator's office, Telsey said. I brought my law library along. I'll look it up myself. She turned to leave the room. My niece, Hillette explained to Dr. Droon, who was beginning to look puzzled, attends law school. She's always been so absorbed in her studies. Telsey? Yes, Hillette. Telsey paused at the door. I'm very glad you're decided to be sensible about this, dear. But don't take too long, will you? We don't want to waste Dr. Droon's time. It shouldn't take more than 5 or 10 minutes, Telsey told her agreeably. She closed the door behind her and went directly to her bedroom on the second floor. One of her 2 valises was still unpacked. She locked the door behind her, opened the unpacked valise, took out a pocket edition law library and sat down at the table with it. She clicked on the library's view screen, tapped the clearing and index buttons. Behind the screen, one of the multiple rows of pinhead tapes shifted slightly as the index was flicked into reading position. Half a minute later, she was glancing over the legal section on which Dr. Droon had based his claim. The library confirmed what he had said. Very neat of Hillette, Telsey thought. Very nasty and pretty idiotic. Even a second-year law student could think immediately of 2 or 3 ways in which a case like that could have been dragged out in Federation's courts for a couple of decades before the question of handing TikTok over to the life banks became too acute. Well, Hillette simply wasn't really intelligent, and the plot to Shanghai TT was hardly even a side issue now. Telsey snapped the tiny library shut, fastened it to the belt of her sunsuit, and went over to the open window. A 2-foot ledge passed beneath the window, leading to a roof of a patio on the right. 50 yards beyond the patio, the garden ended with a natural stone wall. Behind it lay one of the big wooded park areas which formed most of the ground level of Portnache. TikTok wasn't in sight. A sound of voices came from the ground floor windows on the left. Hillette had brought her maid and chauffeur along, and a chef had showed up in time to make breakfast this morning as part of the city's guest house service. Telsey took the empty valise to the window, set it on end against the left side of the frame, and let the window slide down until its lower edge rested on the valise. She went back to the house guard screen panel beside the door, put her finger against the lock button, and pushed. The sound of voices from the lower floor was cut off as outer doors and windows slid silently shut all about the house. Telsey glanced back at the window. The valise had creaked a little as the guard field drove the frame down on it, but was supporting the thrust. She returned to the window, wriggling feet foremost through the opening, twisted around and got a footing on the ledge. A minute later, she was scrambling quietly down a vine-covered patio trellis to the ground. Even after they discovered she was gone, the guard screen would keep everybody in the house for some little while. They'd either have to disengage the screen's main mechanisms and start poking around in them, or force open the door to her bedroom and get the lock unset. Either approach would involve confusion, upset tempers, and generally delay organized pursuit. Telsey edged around the patio and started towards the wall, keeping close to the side of the house so she couldn't be seen from the windows. The shrubbery made minor rustling noises as she threaded her way through it, and then there was a different stirring, which might have been no more than a slow, steady current of air moving among the bushes behind her. She shivered involuntarily, but didn't look back. She came to the wall, stood still, measuring its height, jumped and got an arm across it, swung up a knee, squirmed up and over. She came down on her feet with a small thump in the grass on the other side, glanced back once at the guest house, crossed a path, and went on among the park trees. Within a few hundred yards, it became apparent that she had an escort. She didn't look around for them, but spread out to the right and left like a skirmish line, keeping abreast with her. Occasional shadows slid silently through patches of open, sunlit ground, disappearing again under the trees. Otherwise, there was hardly anyone in sight. Portnaché's human residents appeared to make almost no personal use of the vast parkland spread out beneath their tower apartments, and its traffic moved over the airways, visible from the ground only as rainbow-hued ribbons which bisected the sky between the upper tower levels. An occasional private air car went by overhead. Wisps of thought which were not her own thoughts flicked through Telsey's mind from moment to moment as the silent line of shadows moved deeper into the park with her. She realized she was being sized up, judged, evaluated again. No more information was coming through. They had given her as much information as she needed. In the main, perhaps, they were simply curious now. This was the first human mind they'd been able to make heads or tails of, and that hadn't seemed deaf and silent to their form of communication. They were taking time out to study it. They'd been assured she would have something of genuine importance to tell them, and there was some derision about that, but they were willing to wait a little and find out. They were curious, and they liked games. At the moment, Telsey and what she might try to do to change their plan was the game on which their attention was fixed. 12 minutes passed before the talker on Telsey's wrist began to buzz. It continued to signal on and off for another few minutes, then stopped. Back in the guest house, they couldn't be sure whether she wasn't simply locked inside her room and refusing to answer them, but Telsey quickened her pace. The park's trees gradually became more massive, reached higher above her, stood spaced more widely apart. She passed through the morning shadow of the residential tower nearest the guest house and emerged from it presently on the shore of a small lake. On the other side of the lake, a number of dappled grazing animals, like long-necked, tall horses, lifted their heads to watch her. For some seconds they seemed only mildly interested, but then a breeze moved across the lake, crinkling the surface of the water, and as it touched the opposite shore, abrupt panic exploded among the grazers. They wheeled, went flashing away in effortless 20-foot strides, and were gone among the trees. Telsey felt a crawling along her spine. It was the first objective indication she'd had of the nature of the company she had brought to the lake, and while it hardly came as a surprise, for a moment her urge was to follow the example of the grazers. "Tick-tock?" she whispered, suddenly a little short of breath. A single up-and-down purring note replied from the bushes on her right. TT was still around, for whatever good that might do. Not too much, Telsey thought, if it came to serious trouble, but the knowledge was somewhat reassuring, and this, meanwhile, appeared to be as far as she needed to get from the guest house. They'd be looking for her by air car presently, but there was nothing to tell them in which direction to turn first. She climbed the bank of the lake to a point where she was screened both by thick green shrubbery and the top of a single immense tree from the sky, sat down on some dry, mossy growth, took the law library from her belt, opened it, and placed it in her lap. Vague stirrings indicated that her escort was also settling down in an irregular circle about her, and the apprehension shivered on Telsey's skin again. It wasn't that their attitude was hostile. They were simply overawing, and no one could predict what they might do next. Without looking up, she asked a question in her mind. Ready? Sense of multiple acknowledgement, variously tinged, sardonic, interestingly amused, attentive, doubtful. Impatience quivered through it too, only tentatively held in restraint, and Telsey's forehead was suddenly wet. Some of them seemed on the verge of expressing disapproval with what was being done here. Her fingers quickly flicked in the index tape, and the stir of feelings about her subsided, their attention captured again for the moment. Her thoughts became to some degree detached, ready to dissect another problem in the familiar ways and present the answers to it. Not a very involved problem, essentially, but this time it wasn't a school exercise. Her company waited, withdrawn, silent, aloof once more, while the index blurred, checked, blurred, and checked. Within a minute and a half, she had noted a dozen reference symbols. She tapped in another of the pinhead tapes, glanced over a few paragraphs, licked salty sweat from her lip, and said in her thoughts, emphasizing the meaning of each detail of the sentence so that there would be no misunderstanding. This is the Federation law that applies to the situation which existed originally on this planet. There were no interruptions, no commenting thoughts, no intrusions of any kind as she went step by step through the section, turned to another one and another. In perhaps 12 minutes, she came to the end of the last one and stopped. Instantly, argument exploded about her. Telsey was not involved in the argument. In fact, she could grasp only scraps of it. Either they were excluding her deliberately, or the exchange was too swift, practiced, and varied to allow her to keep up. But their vehemence was not encouraging. And was it reasonable to assume that the Federation's laws would have any meaning for minds like these? Telsey snapped the library shut with fingers that had begun to tremble and placed it on the ground. Then she stiffened. In the sensations washing about her, a special excitement rose suddenly, a surge of almost gleeful wildness that choked away her breath. Awareness followed of a pair of malignant crimson eyes fastened on her, moving steadily closer. A kind of nightmare paralysis seized Telsey. They'd turned her over to that red-eyed horror. She sat still, feeling mouse-sized. Something came out with a crash from a thicket behind her. Her muscles went tight, but it was T.T. who rubbed a hard head against her shoulder, took another 3 stiff-legged steps forward and stopped between Telsey and the bushes on their right, back rigid, neck fur erect, tail twisting. Expectant silence closed in about them. The circle was waiting. In the greenery on the right, something made a slow, heavy stir. T.T.'s lips peeled back from her teeth. Her head swung towards the motion, ears flattening, transformed to a split, snarling demon mask. A long shriek ripped from her lungs, raw with fury, bloodlust, and challenge. The sound died away. For some seconds, the tension about them held. Then came a sense of gradual relaxation mingled with a partly amused approval. Telsey was shaking violently. It had been, she was telling herself, a deliberate test. Not of herself, of course, but of T.T. And Tick-Tock had passed with honors. That her nerves had been half ruined in the process would seem a matter of no consequence to this rugged crew. She realized next that someone here was addressing her personally. It took a few moments to steady her jittering thoughts enough to gain a more definite impression than that. This speaker, she discovered then, was a member of the circle of whom she hadn't been aware before. The thought impressions came hard and cold as iron. A personage who was very evidently in the habit of making major decisions and seeing them carried out. The circle, its moment of sport over, was listening with more than a suggestion of deference. Tick-Tock, far from conciliated, green eyes still blazing, nevertheless was settling down to listen too. Telsey began to understand. Her suggestions, Iron Thoughts informed her, might appear without value to a number of foolish minds here, but he intended to see they were given a fair trial. Did he perhaps hear? He inquired next of the circle, throwing in a casual but horridly vivid impression of snapping spines and slashed, shaggy throats spouting blood. Any objection to that? Dead stillness all around. There was definitely no objection. Tick-Tock began to grin like a pleased kitten. That point having been settled in an orderly manner now, Iron Thoughts went on coldly to Telsey. What specifically did she propose they should do? End of Section 2. Section 3. The car was approaching the lake, but still a good distance off. Its canopy was down, and Telsey could just make out the heads of 3 people inside. Delcroix, Halette's chauffeur, would be flying the vehicle, while Halette and Dr. Droon looked around for her from the sides. 300 yards away, the air car began to turn to the right. Delcroix didn't like his employer much. At a guess, he had just spotted Telsey and was trying to warn her off. Telsey closed the library and put it down, picked up a handful of pebbles and began flicking them idly, one at a time, into the water. The air car vanished to her left. 3 minutes later, she watched its shadow glide across the surface of the lake towards her. Her heart began to thump almost audibly, but she didn't look up. Tick-Tock's purring continued on its regular, unhurried note. The car came to a stop almost directly overhead. After a couple of seconds, there was a clicking noise. The purring ended abruptly. Telsey climbed to her feet as Delcroix brought the car down to the bank of the lake. The chauffeur grinned ruefully at her. A side door had been opened, and Halette and Dr. Droon stood behind it. Halette watched Telsey with a small smile, while the naturalist put the heavy life detector and stun gun device carefully down on the floorboards. "If you're looking for Tick-Tock," Telsey said, "she isn't here." Halette just shook her head sorrowfully. "There's no use lying to us, dear. Dr. Droon just stunned her." They found T.T. collapsed on her side among the shrubs, wearing her natural color. Her eyes were shut, her chest rose and fell in a slow breathing motion. Dr. Droon, looking rather apologetic, pointed out to Telsey that her pet was in no pain, that the stun gun had simply put her comfortably to sleep. He also explained the use of the 2 sets of webbed paralysis belts which he fastened about T.T.'s legs. The effect of the stun charge would wear off in a few minutes, and contact with the inner surfaces of the energized belts would then keep T.T. anesthetized and unable to move until the belts were removed. She would, he repeated, be suffering no pain throughout the process. Telsey didn't comment. She watched Delcroix raise T.T.'s limp body above the level of the bushes with a gravity hoist belonging to Dr. Droon, and maneuver her back to the car. The others followed. Delcroix climbed into the car first, opened the big trunk compartment in the rear. T.T. was slid inside and the trunk compartment locked. "Where are you taking her?" Telsey asked sullenly as Delcroix lifted the car into the air. "To the spaceport, dear," Halette said. "Dr. Droon and I both felt it would be better to spare your feelings by not prolonging the matter unnecessarily." Telsey wrinkled her nose disdainfully and walked up the air car to stand behind Delcroix's seat. She leaned against the back of the seat for an instant. Her legs felt shaky. The chauffeur gave her a sober wink from the side. "That's a dirty trick she played on you, Miss Telsey," he murmured. "I tried to warn you." "I know." Telsey took a deep breath. "Look, Delcroix, in just a minute something's going to happen. It'll look dangerous, but it won't be. Don't let it get you nervous. Right?" "Huh?" Delcroix appeared startled, but kept his voice low. "Just what's gonna happen?" "No time to tell you. Remember what I said." Telsey moved back a few steps from the driver's seat, turned around, said unsteadily, "Halette? Dr. Droon?" Halette had been speaking quietly to Dr. Droon. They both looked up. "If you don't move and don't do anything stupid," Telsey said rapidly, "you won't get hurt. If you do, well, I don't know. You see, there's another Crest cat in the car." In her mind, she added, "Now." It was impossible to tell in just what section of the car Iron Thoughts had been lurking. The carpeting near the rear passenger seat seemed to blur for an instant. Then he was there. Camouflage dropped, sitting on the floorboards 5 feet from the naturalist and Halette. Halette's mouth opened wide. She tried to scream, but fainted instead. Dr. Droon's right hand started out quickly towards the big stun gun device beside his seat. Then he checked himself and sat still, ashen-faced. Telsey didn't blame him for changing his mind. She felt he must be a remarkably brave man to have moved at all. Iron Thoughts, twice as broad across the back as Tick-Tock, twice as massively muscled, looked like a devil beast even to her. His dark green marbled hide was crisscrossed with old scar patterns. Half his tossing crimson crest appeared to have been ripped away. He reached out now in a fluid, silent motion, hooked a paw under the stun gun, and flicked upwards. The big instrument rose in an incredibly swift, steep arc, 80 feet into the air, various parts flying away from it, before it started curving down towards the treetops below the car. Iron Thoughts lazily swung his head around and looked at Telsey with yellow fire eyes. "Miss Telsey? Miss Telsey!" Delcroix was muttering behind her. "You sure it won't?" Telsey swallowed. At the moment, she felt barely mouse-sized again. "Just relax," she told Delcroix in a shaky voice. "He's really quite tame." Iron Thoughts produced a harsh but not unamiable chuckle in her mind. The pearl-gray sports car, covered now by its streamlining canopy, drifted down presently to a parking platform outside the suites of offices on Jonturo's planetary moderator on the 14th floor of the Shikaris Club Tower. An attendant waved it into a vacant slot. Inside the car, Delcroix set the brakes, switched off the engine, asked, "Now what?" "I think," Telsey said reflectively, "we better lock you in the trunk compartment with my aunt and Dr. Droon while I talk to the moderator." The chauffeur shrugged. He'd regained most of his aplomb during the unhurried trip across the parklands. Iron Thoughts had done nothing but sit in the center of the car, eyes half shut, looking like instant death, enjoying a dignified nap and occasionally emitting a rip-sawing noise which might have been either his style of purring or a snore. And Tick-Tock? When Delcroix peeled the paralysis belts off her legs at Telsey's direction, had greeted him with her usual reserved affability. What the chauffeur was suffering from at the moment was intense curiosity, which Telsey had done nothing to relieve. "Just as you say, Miss Telsey," he agreed. "I hate to miss whatever you're going to be doing here, but if you don't lock me up now, Miss Halette will figure I was helping you and fire me as soon as you let her out." Telsey nodded, then cocked her head in the direction of the rear compartment. Faint sounds coming through the door indicated that Halette had regained consciousness and was having hysterics. "You might tell her," Telsey suggested, that there'll be a grown-up crest cat sitting outside the compartment door. This wasn't true, but neither Delcroix nor Harlette could know it. If there's too much racket before I get back, it's likely to irritate him. A minute later, she set both car doors on lock and went outside, wishing she were less informally clothed. Sun briefs and sandals tended to make her look juvenile. The parking attendant appeared startled when she approached him with TikTok striding alongside. "They'll never let you into the offices with that thing, miss," he informed her. "Why, it doesn't even have a collar." "Don't worry about it," Tilsey told him aloofly. She dropped a 2-credit piece she'd taken from Halette's purse into his hand and continued on towards the building's entrance. The attendant squinted after her, trying unsuccessfully to dispel an odd impression that the big cat-like animal with the girl was throwing a double shadow. The moderator's chief receptionist also had some doubts about TT and possibly about the sun briefs, though she seemed impressed when Tilsey's identification tag informed her she was speaking to the daughter of Federation Councilwoman Jessamine Amberdawn. "You feel you can discuss this emergency only with the moderator himself, Miss Amberdawn?" she repeated. "Exactly," Tilsey said firmly. A buzzer sounded as she spoke. The receptionist excused herself and picked up an earphone. She listened a moment, said blandly, "Yes, of course. Yes, I understand." Replaced the earphone and stood up, smiling at Tilsey. "Would you come with me, Miss Amberdawn?" she said. "I think the moderator will see you immediately." Tilsey followed her, chewing thoughtfully at her lip. This was easier than she'd expected. In fact, too easy. Halette's work? Probably. A few comments to the effect of "a highly imaginative child, over-excitable," while Halette was arranging to have the moderator's office authorize TikTok's transfer to the life banks, along with the implication that Jessamine Amberdawn would appreciate a discreet handling of any disturbance Tilsey might create as a result. It was the sort of notion that would appeal to Halette. They passed through a series of elegantly equipped offices and hallways, Tilsey grasping TT's neck fur in lieu of a leash, their appearance creating a tactfully restrained wave of surprise among secretaries and clerks, and if somebody here and there was troubled by a fleeting, uncanny impression that not one large beast, but 2 seemed to be trailing the moderator's visitor down the aisles, no mention was made of what could have been only a momentary visual distortion. Finally, a pair of sliding doors opened ahead, and the receptionist ushered Tilsey into a large, cool balcony garden on the shaded side of the great building. A tall, gray-haired man stood up from the desk at which he was working and bowed to Tilsey. The receptionist withdrew again. "My pleasure, Miss Amberdawn," Jean Theroux's planetary moderator said. "Be seated, please." He studied TikTok with more than casual interest while Tilsey was settling herself into the chair, added, "And what may I and my office do for you?" Tilsey hesitated. She'd observed his type on Arado in her mother's circle of acquaintances. A senior diplomat, a man not easy to impress. It was a safe bet that he'd had her brought out to his balcony office only to keep her occupied while Halette was quietly informed where the Amberdawn problem child was and requested to come over and take charge. What she had to tell him now would have sounded rather wild even if presented by a presumably responsible adult. She could provide proof, but until the moderator was already nearly sold on her story, that would be a very unsafe thing to do. Old Iron Thoughts was backing her up, but if it didn't look as if her plans were likely to succeed, he would be willing to ride herd on his devil's pack just so long. Better start the ball rolling without any preliminaries, Tilsey decided. The moderator's picture of her must be that of a spoiled, neurotic brat in a stew about the threatened loss of a pet animal. He expected her to start arguing with him immediately about TikTok. She said, "Do you have a personal interest in keeping the Balut crest cats from becoming extinct?" Surprise flickered in his eyes for an instant. Then he smiled. "I admit I do, Miss Amberden," he said pleasantly. "I should like to see the species reestablished. I count myself almost uniquely fortunate in having had the opportunity to bag 2 of the magnificent brutes before disease wiped them out on the planet." That last seemed less than fortunate statement just now. Tilsey felt a sharp tingle of alarm, then sensed that in the minds which were drawing the meaning of the moderator's speech from her mind, there had been only a brief stir of interest. She cleared her throat and said, "The point is that they weren't wiped out by disease." He considered her quizzically, seemed to wonder what she was trying to lead up to. Tilsey gathered her courage, plunged on. "Would you like to hear what did happen?" "I should be very much interested, Miss Amberden," the moderator said without change of expression. "But first, if you'll excuse me a moment." There had been some signal from his desk which Tilsey hadn't noticed, because he picked up a small communicator now and said, "Yes?" After a few seconds he resumed, "That's rather curious, isn't it?" "Yes, I'd try that." "No, that shouldn't be necessary." "Yes, please do. Thank you." He replaced the communicator, his face very sober then, his eyes flicking for an instant to TT. He drew one of the upper desk drawers open a few inches and turned back to Tilsey. "Now, Miss Amberden," he said affably, "you were about to say about the crest cats?" Tilsey swallowed. She hadn't heard the other side of the conversation, but she could guess what it had been about. His office had called the guest house and been told by Hallette's maid that Hallette, the chauffeur, and Dr. Droon were out looking for Miss Tilsey and her pet. The moderator's office had then checked on the sports car communication number and attempted to call it, and of course there had been no response. To the moderator, considering what Hallette would have told him, it must add up to the grim possibility that the young lunatic he was talking to had let her 3/4 grown crest cat slaughter her aunt and 2 men when they caught up with her. The office would be notifying the police now to conduct an immediate search for the missing air car. When it would occur to them to look for it on the moderator's parking terrace was something Tilsey couldn't know, but if Hallette and Dr. Droon were released before the moderator accepted her own version of what had occurred, and the 2 reported the presence of wild crest cats in Port-Neches, there would be almost no possibility of keeping the situation under control. Somebody was bound to make some idiotic move, and the fat would be in the fire. 2 things might be in her favor. The moderator seemed to have the sort of steady nerve one would expect in a man who had bagged 2 Balut crest cats. The partly open desk drawer beside him must have a gun in it. Apparently he considered that a sufficient precaution against an attack by TT. He wasn't likely to react in a panicky manner, and the mere fact that he suspected Tilsey of homicidal tendencies would make him give the closest attention to what she said. Whether he believed her then was another matter, of course. Slightly encouraged, Tilsey began to talk. It did sound like a thoroughly wild story, but the moderator listened with an appearance of intent interest. When she had told him as much as she felt he could be expected to swallow for a start, he said musingly, "So, they weren't wiped out? They went into hiding. Do I understand you to say that they did it to avoid being hunted?" Tilsey chewed her lip frowningly before replying. "There's something about that part I don't quite get," she admitted. "Of course, I don't quite get either why you'd want to go hunting twice for something that's just as likely to bag you instead." "Well, those are merely the statistical odds," the moderator explained. "If one has enough confidence, you see." "I don't really. But the crest cat seemed to have felt the same way, at first. They were getting around 100 for every cat that got shot. Humans were the most exciting game they'd ever run into. But then that ended, and the humans started knocking them out with stun guns from air cars where they couldn't be got at, and hauling them off while they were helpless. After it had gone on a while, they decided to keep out of sight." but they're still around. Thousands and thousands of them. Another thing nobody's known about them is that they weren't only in the Balut Mountains. There were crest cats scattered all through the big forests along the other side of the continent. Very interesting, the moderator commented. Very interesting indeed. He glanced toward the communicator, then returned his gaze to Telzi, drumming his fingers lightly on the desktop. She could tell nothing at all from his expression now, but she guessed he was thinking hard. There was supposed to be no native intelligent life in the legal sense on Shantaru, and she had been careful to say nothing so far to make the Balut cats look like more than rather exceptionally intelligent animals. The next, rather large, question should be how she'd come by such information. If the moderator asked her that, Telzi thought, she could feel she'd made a beginning at getting him to buy the whole story. Well, he said abruptly, if the crest cats are not extinct or threatened with extinction, the life banks obviously have no claim on your pet. He smiled confidingly at her. And that's the reason you're here, isn't it? Well, no, Telzi began, dismayed. Oh, it's quite all right, Miss Amberdawn. I'll simply rescind the permit that was issued for the purpose. You need feel no further concern about that. He paused. Now, just one question. Do you happen to know where your aunt is at present? Telzi had a dead, sinking feeling. So he hadn't believed a word she'd said. He'd been stalling her along until the air car could be found. She took a deep breath. You better listen to the rest of it. Why, is there more? The moderator asked politely. Yes, the important part. The kind of creatures they are. They wouldn't go into hiding indefinitely just because someone was after them. Was there a flicker of something beyond watchfulness in his expression? What would they do, Miss Amberdawn? He asked quietly. If they couldn't get at the men in the air cars and couldn't communicate with them, the flicker again, they'd start looking for the place the men came from, wouldn't they? It might take them some years to work their way across the continent and locate us here in Port-Neches, but supposing they did it finally, and a few thousand of them are sitting around the parks down there right now, they could come up the side of these towers as easily as they go up the side of a mountain. And supposing they decided that the only way to handle the problem was to clean out the human beings in Port-Neches. The moderator stared at her in silence a few seconds. You're saying, he observed then, that they're rational beings, above the critical IQ level? Well, Telzi said, legally they're rational. I checked on that. About as rational as we are, I suppose. Would you mind telling me now how you happen to know this? They told me, Telzi said. He was silent again, studying her face. You mentioned, Miss Amberdawn, that they have been unable to communicate with other human beings. This suggests, then, that you are a xenotelepath? I am? Telzi hadn't heard the term before. If it means that I can tell what the cats are thinking, and they can tell what I'm thinking, I guess that's the word for it. She considered him, decided she had him almost on the ropes, went on quickly. I looked up the laws and told them they could conclude a treaty with the Federation which would establish them as an affiliated species, and that would settle everything the way they would want it settled without trouble. Some of them believed me. They decided to wait until I could talk to you. If it works out, fine. If it doesn't, she felt her voice falter for an instant. They're going to cut loose. Fast. The moderator seemed undisturbed. What am I supposed to do? I told them you'd contact the Council of the Federation on Laredo. Contact the Council, he repeated coolly. With no more proof for this story than your word, Miss Amberdawn? Telzi felt a quick, angry stirring begin about her, felt her face whiten. All right, she said, I'll give you proof. I'll have to now, but that'll be it. Once they've tipped their hand all the way, you'll have about 30 seconds left to make the right move. I hope you remember that." He cleared his throat. "Now," Telsey said. Along the walls of the balcony garden, beside the ornamental flower stands, against the edges of the rock pool, the crest cats appeared. Perhaps 30 of them. None quite as physically impressive as Iron Thoughts, who stood closest to the moderator, but none very far from it. Motionless as rocks, frightening as gargoyles, they waited, eyes glowing with hellish excitement. "This is their council, you see," Telsey heard herself saying. The moderator's face had also paled, but he was, after all, an old shikari and a senior diplomat. He took an unhurried look around the circle, said quietly, "Accept my profound apologies for doubting you, Miss Abaddon," and reached for the desk communicator. Iron Thought swung his demon head in Telsey's direction. For an instant, she picked up the mental impression of a fierce yellow eye closing in an approving wink. "An open transmitter line to Oredo," the moderator was saying into the communicator. "The council. And snap it up. Some very important visitors are waiting." The offices of Jean Theroux's planetary moderator became an extremely busy and interesting area then. Quite 2 hours passed before it occurred to anyone to ask Telsey again whether she knew where her aunt was at present. Telsey smote her forehead. "I forgot all about that," she admitted, fishing the sports car's keys out of the pocket of her sunbriefs. "They're out on the parking platform." The preliminary treaty arrangements between the Federation of the Hub and the new affiliated species of the planet of Jantaro were formally ratified 2 weeks later, the ceremony taking place on Jantaro in the Champagne Hall of the Shikaris Club. Telsey was able to follow the event only by news viewer in her ship cabin, she and Halette being on the return trip to Oredo by then. She wasn't too interested in the treaty's details. They conformed almost exactly to what she'd read out to Iron Thoughts and his co-chiefs and companions in the park. It was the smooth bridging of the wide language gap between the contracting parties by a row of interpreting machines and a handful of human xenotelepaths which held her attention. As she switched off the viewer, Halette came wandering in from the adjoining cabin. "I was watching it too," Halette observed. She smiled. "I was hoping to see dear TikTok." Telsey looked over at her. "Well, TT would hardly be likely to show up in Port Neche," she said. "She's having too good a time now finding out what life in the Balut Range is like." "I suppose so," Halette agreed doubtfully, sitting down on the hassock. "But I'm glad she promised to get in touch with us again in a few years. I'll miss her." Telsey regarded her aunt with a reflective frown. Halette meant it quite sincerely, of course. She had undergone a profound change of heart during the past 2 weeks. But Telsey wasn't without some doubts about the actual value of a change of heart brought on by telepathic means. The learning process the Crest Cats had started in her mind appeared to have continued automatically several days longer than her rugged teachers had really intended, and Telsey had reason to believe that by the end of that time she'd developed associated latent abilities of which the Crest Cats had never heard. She'd barely begun to get it all sorted out yet, but as an example, she found it remarkably easy to turn Halette's more obnoxious attitudes virtually upside down. It had taken her a couple of days to get the hang of her aunt's personal symbolism, but after that there'd been no problem. She was reasonably certain she'd broken no laws so far, though the sections in the law library covering the use and abuse of sonic abilities were veiled in such intricate and downright obscuring phrasing. Deliberately, Telsey suspected that it was really difficult to say what they did mean. But even aside from that, there were a number of arguments in favor of exercising great caution. Jessamine, for one thing, was bound to start worrying about her sister-in-law's health if Halette turned up on Oredo in her present state of mind, even though it would make for a far more agreeable atmosphere in the Amberdawn household. "Halette?" Telsey inquired mentally. Do you remember what an all-out stinker you used to be? Of course, dear, Alette said aloud. I can hardly wait to tell dear Jessamine how much I regret the many times Well, Telsey went on, still verbalizing it silently, I think you'd really enjoy life more if you were, let's say, about halfway between your old nasty self and the sort of sickening good kind you are now. Why, Telsey, Alette cried out with dopey amiability, what a delightful idea. Let's try it, Telsey said. There was silence in the cabin for some 20 minutes then, while she went painstakingly about remolding a number of Halette's character traits for the second time. She still felt some misgivings about it, but if it became necessary, she probably could always restore the old Halette in toto. These, she told herself, definitely were powers one should treat with respect. Better rattle through law school first, then, with that out of the way, she could start hunting around to see who in the Federation was qualified to instruct a genius-level novice in the proper handling of sonics. End of Section 3. End of Novice by James H. Schmitz.